I remember the day she left as though it's branded into my very soul. It was early, a Tuesday if my memory serves, and the house felt oddly quiet, wrapped in that hush that comes just before a thunderstorm. I glanced at the kitchen table, expecting to see her familiar silhouette sipping coffee, but all that greeted me was an empty chair. My heart gave a sudden jolting thump. As I walked from room to room, I realized she was gone. Her closet half emptied, her favorite books missing from the shelf, and not a single note left behind. Just silence and the slow, agonizing realization that my wife had moved out without a word. I think about that morning all the time. How different it might have been if I'd woken up earlier, if I'd noticed signs of her discontent sooner, or if I'd simply asked the right question at the right time. But life, as I've come to learn, rarely offers us do-overs. When I found the empty closet and the missing toiletries, I was too stunned to react. I just stood there, one hand gripping the dresser's edge, trying to steady myself while the rest of my mind spun in wild circles. That first rush of disbelief barreled into me so fiercely that I wondered if I was still dreaming, or trapped in some bizarre, twisted reality. The hours after she left crawled by in a haze. I must have paced the length of the house 100 times, searching for clues. Had she planned this for weeks, months even? The idea that she could pack her life and vanish in a single morning seemed implausible, yet the emptiness proved otherwise. There was no note taped to the fridge, no final text message on my phone. The last communication I had from her was a mundane question about groceries sent the previous evening. Should we get extra eggs this week? Now the fridge still boasted a carton and a half. Eggs to feed 2 people, left behind in a house now holding only 1. I made calls, to her closest friends, to her parents, to old acquaintances we'd known for years. No one knew anything concrete. Or at least no one admitted to knowing. Everyone sounded shocked or claimed they were. "No, I haven't heard from her," they'd say, their voices laced with concern and confusion. The only hint, one that made my stomach twist, came from a college friend of hers I'd met just twice. She mentioned feeling restless, the friend said vaguely as if trying not to betray some secret. Before I could press further, the line went dead with a polite "I'm sorry" that left me feeling more helpless than ever. Days bled into nights, and nights stretched into an excruciating blur of worry, anger, and longing. I slept little, ate even less, and found myself staring at the ceiling until dawn. Mornings were the worst, waking with a gasp, thinking for a fraction of a second that she was still there, only to remember with a heartbreak that felt like a fresh wound each time that she wasn't. I couldn't concentrate on work. My productivity plummeted. My boss offered me time off, sympathy edging into pity in his eyes. I accepted a few days of leave, though all that meant was I had more hours to wander around a house filled with her absence. Friends, real friends, tried to help. They brought groceries, takeout, or just their presence, but I couldn't manage to hold a conversation longer than a few minutes without my thoughts drifting to her. I'd catch myself scanning the living room for any traces she'd left behind. The scattered paintbrushes from her art supplies were gone. Even the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table had vanished. It was as though she'd surgically removed every fragment of herself from my life, leaving me with only the ghosts of memories that refused to evaporate. 2 weeks after her disappearance, when I'd finally begun to suspect she might never return, I got the call that rearranged my world yet again. It was late, nearing midnight, and I was lying on the couch, half buried under a blanket, staring at an old photograph from our honeymoon. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Part of me wanted to ignore it. At that point, any call from someone I didn't know felt like a potential harbinger of more bad news. Still, I answered, hoping it could be a lead to her whereabouts or at least an explanation. A man's voice came over the line, smooth and assured in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hey there," he said, as though we were casual acquaintances. "You don't know me, but I thought you should know. I'm with your wife." At first, the words refused to compute. My mind reeled, and a hot flush of anger, betrayal, and stunned incredulity spread through my body. "What? My wife?" The statement alone was a blow. He sounded calm, even somewhat sympathetic, as though he was delivering an unwanted present and felt compelled to soften the blow. In the background I heard a muffled voice, her voice. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought I might faint. I stumbled through the phone call, not sure which questions were even worth asking. The stranger's tone was oddly conciliatory. He said he just wanted me to know she was safe, that she needed time away. Time away from me, presumably. I felt my throat tighten with every syllable he uttered, the sting of knowing that she had confided in him enough to let him call me. After a painful pause, he admitted, "I'm her boyfriend." Boyfriend. The word seemed plucked from someone else's drama, not mine. I struggled to form coherent words in response, but everything I managed to say came out jumbled, half accusatory, half desperate. In the end, he hung up with a cool, "Take care," leaving me clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline. Except it wasn't. There was no comfort in that call, only a new realm of disbelief and heartache. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the same spot for hours, replaying the conversation with a sick sense of unreality. My wife not only walked out on me but she'd found someone new so quickly, or had she been with him even before she left? My imagination raced, conjuring up awful images of clandestine meetings and whispered phone calls. "I'm her boyfriend." The phrase echoed in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Eventually, the phone slipped from my grasp and I buried my face in my hands, overcome by a numbness that was almost worse than pain. In the days that followed, my initial shock gave way to a strange, simmering fury. I vacillated between heartbreak and rage, sometimes tipping over into a sense of grim determination that I would move on too. But how does one move on from an abrupt betrayal like this? I was still uncertain whether it was even a betrayal in the conventional sense, but it felt like one. She had left with no goodbye, no explanation, and now I was expected to accept that she was with someone else? People talk about heartbreak as though it's a single, definable entity. In reality, heartbreak is a kaleidoscope of shifting emotions, grief, nostalgia, spite, regret, and everything in between. I'd find myself longing for her one moment, cursing her name the next, and then drowning in a tidal wave of self-recrimination. What did I do wrong? How could I have changed? Where did this new man come from, and how had I missed every sign? Sometimes, late at night, I'd pace the kitchen, replaying old conversations, scanning them for hints. Was it her tone of voice one evening when she came home late from the studio? The way she'd grown quiet when I asked about her day? It soon became unbearable to stay in the house. Everything reminded me of her. The faint floral scent in the bathroom, the chipped coffee mug she'd adored, the paint stain on the table's corner from a half-finished canvas she'd been working on. So I left. I stuffed some clothes and essentials into a worn duffel bag, locked the door behind me and drove aimlessly for hours. At first, I ended up in a diner on the outskirts of town, nursing a bad cup of coffee while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Then I found myself calling an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year because I'd been too wrapped up in my own routine to maintain connections. That friend, Adam, invited me to crash on his couch for a few days. He lived in a tiny apartment above a bookstore, the sort of place you'd imagine an aspiring poet might occupy. The walls were lined with shelves full of tattered classics, and the living room was dominated by a mismatched sofa that had clearly seen better days. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt a touch of relief. At least here, I wouldn't be surrounded by her ghost. Adam, who'd once been my college roommate, didn't press for details right away. He offered me a beer, then sat across from me, waiting patiently for me to talk. I didn't at first. I just sipped in silence, letting the tension in my body slowly unwind. Eventually, words started to flow, haltingly at first, then in a rush I couldn't control. I told him how she'd left without saying goodbye, how I discovered her clothes missing, how I spent 2 weeks in limbo, and how the phone call from this new boyfriend had rattled me to my core. Adam listened with the kind of focus only a true friend can muster. He didn't interrupt, he didn't judge. When I finally finished, he exhaled and said, "Man, that's messed up." A simple statement, but in its bluntness, I found more comfort than any platitude could have offered. The quiet acceptance in his eyes told me that, at least here, my pain was valid. I wasn't overreacting or making it up. My sense of betrayal was real. Over the next few days, I settled into a pattern at Adam's place. I'd wake up on his couch, mind still foggy from restless sleep, and try to piece together a plan for the day. Sometimes I'd walk downstairs to the bookstore, running my fingers along dusty spines, picking up novels or memoirs I'd never considered reading before. My mind was too scattered to absorb whole chapters, but the proximity of words, stories, and the quiet hum of other people's lives offered a strange solace. At night, Adam and I would sit on the couch with the lights dimmed, the glow of a single lamp illuminating bottles of cheap beer and takeout containers. We'd talk about anything, childhood memories, old friends, the state of the world, anything that could distract me from the reality waiting to pounce when I'd lie down to sleep. In those moments of distraction, I realized I wasn't alone. Betrayal, heartbreak, abrupt departures, these were universal experiences. Everyone, at some point in life, faces a moment when the rug is pulled out from under them. That realization didn't lessen the pain, but it comforted me to know that I wasn't the only person stumbling through a minefield of raw emotions. Maybe I thought if so many others had survived such turmoil I could too. It was a fragile kind of hope, but a hope nonetheless. That's not to say it was easy. Some nights, the anger would flare up again. I'd snap at Adam for no reason, or bury my face in my hands as my mind conjured images of her, laughing, carefree, entangled in the arms of this stranger who'd had the audacity to call me. I often wondered if she was relieved, having escaped a life she must have found suffocating. The thought was a punch to the gut. Had I been so oblivious that she saw me as an impediment, a barrier to some new happiness? Worst of all was the not knowing. There was so much she hadn't told me. Why didn't she just say something, anything, before she left? Why leave me to piece the puzzle together in the aftermath of a cryptic phone call? I found myself obsessing over it like a detective in a pulp novel, searching old social media posts, scanning through shared photos, looking for any clue that might explain how we had disintegrated from a couple once brimming with potential into two strangers. I began jotting down questions in a worn notebook Adam had lent me. Page after page filled with inquiries I might never get answers to. When did she stop loving me? Did she ever really love me at all? Was this new boyfriend someone from her past, or a random person she met a month ago? Each question carved deeper into my psyche, yet writing them down felt oddly cathartic, as though transferring them from mind to page lessened their weight, however slightly. Then, on a muggy afternoon, a good 3 weeks after I'd first discovered her missing, I noticed I had a voicemail from an unknown number. My stomach lurched. It might be him again, or maybe it was her, finally deciding to speak for herself. I pressed play, hands shaking, but the message was simply static. A dull hiss that lasted a few seconds before cutting off. I listened to it 3 times, hoping for some faint echo in the background, a clue, a syllable, but there was nothing. The emptiness resonated, feeding the gnawing void that had become my constant companion. In the swirl of confusion and despair, I also had a job to think about, a life that demanded I return to some semblance of normalcy. My boss, though sympathetic, hinted that my indefinite absence wasn't sustainable. Responsibility loomed, reminding me that bills needed paying and a future, no matter how fractured, needed constructing. But how does one function when a central pillar of their existence is suddenly yanked away? I felt like an actor stumbling through a half-forgotten script, delivering lines and going through motions that no longer seemed to belong to me. Still, even under the weight of such uncertainty, a tiny spark of resolve began flickering in my chest. One part of me refused to remain in the shadows of her disappearance. If she had truly moved on, if she had someone else calling to announce her safety, then maybe, painful though it was, I had to face the truth that our chapter was over. Clinging to false hope would only magnify the heartache. Perhaps the only way forward was to accept the reality of her choice and figure out who I was without her. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, how we'd laugh about trivial things, how we'd dream of traveling the world together, how we once believed in each other's potential. It felt like a lifetime ago, a movie starring people I barely recognized. When did we diverge? I asked myself. Where was the fork in the road that led her so far from me? The answers remained elusive, dancing just beyond my grasp. Yet, something in me understood that chasing them down might not bring closure. Some mysteries are unsolvable, some endings remain ambiguous. What I did know was that I couldn't keep floating in limbo forever. My mind, my body, my heart, they all demanded direction, demanded a reason to keep going despite the rubble of my former life. And so, amid the gloom and the uncertainty, I resolved to begin rebuilding. I didn't know where that process would lead me or how I'd manage to deal with the scorching pain of her abandonment. But one thing was certain. I had a choice, either let this define and consume me, or let it be the spark that ignited a new self-discovery. It wouldn't be easy, it might well be the hardest thing I'd ever done. But at least it was a choice, and in a life that felt hijacked by someone else's decisions, reclaiming that agency felt like a small but crucial victory. I promised myself that no matter what happened next, I would learn from this. I would uncover the part of me that I'd lost somewhere in our marriage, maybe even before that, and I would nurture it back to life. And if, by some miracle, she or her new boyfriend decided to contact me again, I'd be prepared. Not necessarily with anger or forgiveness, but with the dignity to face them without crumbling. Part of me still ached for closure, for the comfort of a final conversation or an explanation of some sort. But I had come to realize that closure might never arrive with a neat little bow. Sometimes we have to create our own. And as I stood at the brink of that realization, the phone call from her new boyfriend echoing in my mind, I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Life, with all its turmoil, was still mine to shape, even if I had to do it with trembling hands and a shattered heart. The day after I decided to reclaim my agency, I sat on Adam's couch with a cup of coffee balanced on my knees. Morning light filtered through the blinds, striping the worn carpet in lines of gold and shadow. It was a quiet moment, just me, the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint stirrings of a city awakening outside. But something in the air felt different. The heaviness that had weighed on me for weeks lifted ever so slightly, replaced by a restless energy I couldn't quite name. I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, letting the bitterness root me in the present. My wife was gone, possibly living with her new boyfriend. The countless questions I'd scribbled in my notebook still had no answers. Yet, as my eyes wandered over the stacks of books on Adam's shelves, I realized I had a choice: keep circling the same storm of confusion or move forward, uncertain though that path might be. That morning I made a plan, nothing too ambitious but enough to give structure to my days. First, I'd hunt for a short-term rental, a place that was mine alone. I couldn't return to the house filled with her absence. It felt haunted by the life we were supposed to share. Second, I'd see if I could negotiate a part-time schedule with my boss. I needed to keep my job, but I also needed space to sort out my emotional state. Third, I'd reach out to a therapist, something I'd resisted in the past for reasons I couldn't even articulate. Pride maybe. Or fear of digging too deep. But I knew I couldn't navigate this upheaval on my own. I started by searching online listings for any decent apartments in my price range. Adam helped, scanning local forums and community boards. We found a tiny studio that looked promising, one room and a kitchenette, nothing fancy but available immediately. After a hurried email exchange with the landlord and a quick tour later that afternoon, I signed a lease on the spot. The walls were a dull beige, the carpet had seen better days, and the windows faced a busy street, but it offered me a chance to rebuild. The following week, I moved out of Adam's place with a duffel bag and 2 cardboard boxes. Standing at the doorway of my new studio, I felt an odd mixture of relief and trepidation. Relief because I had control over something in my life at last. Trepidation because making a fresh start meant acknowledging that the old life was well and truly over. That first night in the studio, I barely slept. Sirens wailed sporadically outside, and the hum of traffic served as a constant background chorus. My belongings were scattered haphazardly around the space, clothes piled on a chair, a borrowed air mattress in the corner. Still, as I stared at the ceiling, I found a peculiar comfort in the chaos. This little box of a room was entirely mine, untainted by memories of her. In the days that followed, I kept to my plan. My boss agreed to a temporary part-time arrangement, giving me time to attend therapy sessions and sort out the logistical mess left behind by my wife's disappearance. I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Moreno, a recommendation from Adam's sister who swore by her compassion and insight. I arrived at the clinic with my hands shaking, not sure how to condense my unraveling marriage into a coherent narrative. But the moment I sat on Dr. Moreno's worn leather couch and started talking, a dam broke inside me. I told her everything: the morning I discovered my wife's empty closet, the desperate search for her whereabouts, the phone call from that man who claimed to be her new boyfriend. Dr. Moreno listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, her gentle prompts guiding me deeper into emotions I'd been avoiding. We spoke of heartbreak, of betrayal, of the dizzying swirl of shame and anger. Over time, she helped me untangle my sense of self-worth from my wife's abrupt departure. "You're allowed to grieve," she said in our second session, her voice firm yet empathetic. "You're also allowed to acknowledge your anger. But you have to start recognizing that her choices are not necessarily reflections of your value." I heard her words, felt them sink in, but putting them into practice was another matter entirely. Some nights, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced I'd heard my wife's footsteps outside the studio door. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of a couple laughing together on the street and be overwhelmed with envy and sorrow. But slowly, painstakingly, I learned to name these emotions, to sit with them rather than run away. Amid this emotional work, life refused to stand still. Bills had to be paid, errands run, emails answered. I returned to my job in a limited capacity, tackling projects with renewed focus. Perhaps it was a coping mechanism, but I found that throwing myself into tasks offered a reprieve from the endless loop of why that haunted my thoughts. My boss, though sympathetic, also appreciated my rekindled diligence. It turned out that heartbreak could sometimes fuel productivity, at least temporarily. One late afternoon, a couple of weeks into my new routine, I got another call from an unknown number. My stomach lurched at the sight of the screen. Steeling myself, I answered, half expecting that same smooth voice telling me more things I didn't want to hear. Instead, a hesitant female voice said, "Hi, it's me." I froze. It was her, my wife. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. A swirl of questions collided in my mind, but when I tried to speak, I found only a strangled sound escaped my throat. She spoke quickly as if fearful I'd hang up. "I'm sorry," she began. "I know this is strange, but I just wanted to make sure you're okay." The hypocrisy of her concern sparked a flash of anger. She's worried if I'm okay? After vanishing without a word? But the anger was tempered by a desperate curiosity. Why now? Why this call? She offered no grand explanation, just a stammered apology that she knew wasn't enough, and a string of vague assurances that she needed space. She didn't mention the boyfriend or offer to meet in person. We hung up with more questions unanswered than answered. Yet oddly, the conversation left me less anxious than I'd anticipated. It confirmed what Dr. Moreno had been drilling into me. Her leaving was about her, not necessarily about some fundamental flaw in me. Still, hearing her voice pulled me back into a storm of conflicting emotions. 4 days after, I felt unsteady, as if all the progress I'd made was threatened by a single phone call. But I refused to let myself regress entirely. I clung to Dr. Moreno's advice, to the new routines that gave my life structure, and to the fragile sense of identity I was forging in this cramped studio apartment. Meanwhile, I discovered small pockets of joy in unexpected places. The bookstore below Adam's old apartment became a frequent refuge, its smell of ink and paper oddly soothing. I started attending a weekly writing workshop, an outgrowth of my journaling habit. Sitting around a table with strangers turned friends, all of us sharing snippets of poetry or personal essays, made me feel less alone. We were each wrestling with our own sorrows, be it lost love, family estrangements, or the existential dread of unfulfilled dreams. Their empathy was a balm, and sharing my raw, intimate reflections on heartbreak felt surprisingly liberating.